Margaret Evans had always been a woman who kept her struggles hidden behind a gentle smile. Living in a modest home in Parramatta, Sydney, she had raised her only son, Daniel, after her husband left them when Daniel was just a boy. From working night shifts at the hospital laundry to cleaning offices in the city, Margaret did it all without complaint. Every dollar she earned was carefully saved for Daniel's future. Daniel grew up to be a bright and ambitious man. Margaret was proud when he became an architect and moved to the eastern suburbs. She barely visited his sleek apartment, not wanting to intrude on the life he had built. It was enough for her to know that he was happy and successful. But as the years went by, Margaret's health began to decline. A fall at the local market left her with a severe injury to her hip. The doctors told her she would need surgery soon, or she might never walk without pain again. Margaret, never one to burden anyone, kept this to herself for as long as she could. One crisp autumn morning, Margaret sat at her kitchen table, staring at the medical bills. The amount was overwhelming, far beyond what her modest savings could cover. But she told herself that somehow she would manage. She always had. Her neighbor, Mrs. Patel, often saw her wince as she walked to collect the post and finally convinced Margaret to share her troubles. Mrs. Patel insisted that Daniel had a right to know. After all, he was her son. That evening, Margaret picked up the phone, her hands trembling. When Daniel answered, she hesitated. But before she could speak, he began telling her excitedly about Jessica's mother, Barbara. Barbara was about to undergo a procedure that would make her look 10 years younger. Daniel spoke with such enthusiasm, describing how expensive it was and how he was proud to help pay for it. Margaret's heart sank. She listened quietly, swallowing her pain. The moment to speak had passed. She did not want to sound selfish. After all, what was a little pain compared to her son's happiness? She hung up the phone and sat in silence, the weight of her sacrifice heavier than ever. The days that followed felt heavier for Margaret. Each morning, she tried to go about her routine as best as she could. She shuffled between the kitchen and the small garden she loved, though every step was laced with pain. The simple act of watering her plants became a reminder of how fragile her body had become. Margaret kept telling herself that Daniel would come and visit. Perhaps then she could gently mention the surgery, without making him feel guilty or torn. But the visit never came. Daniel sent messages, cheerful and full of plans for Barbara's recovery and how they would celebrate after her procedure was done. There was always a reason for him not to visit. Work deadlines, meetings, taking Jessica and Barbara to appointments. One chilly evening, as the wind rattled the windows of her small house, Margaret sat by the fire with a worn blanket over her legs. She stared at an old photo of Daniel as a boy, grinning with his missing front tooth, holding up a drawing he had made for her birthday. She remembered the promise she had made to herself all those years ago, that she would give him the best life she could, even if it meant giving up her own dreams. But now, with her health fading and the surgery becoming more urgent, Margaret began to wonder if all her quiet sacrifices had only taught Daniel to look past her needs. Had she done too good a job at hiding her struggles? Had she made it too easy for him to forget? One afternoon, Mrs. Patel knocked on her door, bringing a pot of warm curry. The kind gesture brought tears to Margaret's eyes. As they sat together, Margaret shared more than she intended, her voice trembling as she spoke of the surgery, the pain, and the money she did not have. Mrs. Patel listened, her face filled with concern. She offered to speak to Daniel, but Margaret refused. She still held on to the hope that her son would see her need without being told by someone else. A mother's pride, perhaps, or simply a heart too tender to risk rejection. That night, as the city of Sydney glowed beyond her window, Margaret lay awake, the silence of the house pressing down on her. The weight of her unspoken words grew heavier with each passing hour. A week later, on a bright Sunday morning, Margaret was surprised to hear the sound of a car pulling up outside. She peered through the window, her heart skipping a beat as she saw Daniel stepping out, carrying a bag of groceries. For a moment, hope stirred within her. Perhaps he had finally sensed that something was wrong. Perhaps he had come to see how she was coping. Daniel entered with his usual charm, kissing his mother's cheek and chatting about the traffic and the weather. He set the groceries on the table and began unpacking them, proudly pointing out the organic vegetables and fresh bread he had brought. Margaret smiled, grateful for the gesture, but her mind was focused on finding the right moment to speak. They sat down for tea, the familiar warmth of their conversations filling the room. Daniel spoke of work, of a new project near the harbor, and of how Jessica was planning a party for Barbara to celebrate the success of her surgery. His words were filled with excitement, and Margaret listened, nodding in all the right places, though her heart ached. Finally, she took a deep breath. As Daniel stirred his tea, she began to speak, her voice soft and careful. She told him about the fall, about the pain that had grown worse, and about the doctor's recommendation for surgery. She mentioned the cost, though she tried to downplay how serious the situation had become. Daniel's smile faded slightly. He looked at her with concern but also with hesitation. He spoke gently, saying how sorry he was that she had been struggling, and promised to see what he could do. But then, almost in the same breath, he added that his finances were tight at the moment, with Barbara's recovery and some unexpected expenses at work. Margaret nodded, forcing a smile. She told him not to worry, that she understood. But as he hugged her goodbye and drove away, the emptiness in the house felt even greater than before. The visit that she had longed for had come and gone, and her hope had dimmed just a little more. She sat alone once more, the ticking of the clock the only sound in the quiet room, and wondered how much longer she could endure. The following weeks were a blur of quiet struggle for Margaret. Her steps grew slower, the pain sharper. She began to rely more on her cane, though even that provided little relief. The house that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a cage, its walls closing in as her world grew smaller with each passing day. One afternoon, as she tried to sweep the front porch, Margaret lost her balance and fell hard onto the wooden boards. The sharp cry that escaped her lips brought Mrs. Patel running. With great effort, and with the help of another neighbor, Mr. Chin, they lifted her gently and settled her into a chair. That evening, Mrs. Patel returned, this time with Mr. Chin and a young woman from down the street named Emily. They sat with Margaret, speaking softly and kindly, as if afraid to disturb the fragile calm of the small house. Margaret, overwhelmed by their kindness, confessed more of her troubles, tears filling her eyes as she spoke of her need for surgery and her fear of becoming a burden. To her surprise, Emily spoke up. She worked at a local charity that helped elderly residents with medical needs. She offered to look into possible support, promising to return with information. Mr. Chun mentioned a community fundraiser they could organize, something small at first, but enough to get started. Margaret felt torn between gratitude and shame. She had spent her whole life giving without asking for anything in return. Now, to accept help from near strangers felt both humbling and strange. Yet deep down, she knew she could not go on like this much longer. That night, for the first time in many weeks, Margaret allowed herself to hope again. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way forward that did not depend on the son who had grown blind to her suffering. As she drifted into a restless sleep, she dreamed of walking freely again, of the sun on her face and the breeze in her hair, and of a future where she could stand tall once more. True to her word, Emily returned a few days later, carrying a folder filled with forms and pamphlets. She sat at Margaret's small kitchen table, patiently explaining each document. There were grants available, assistance schemes from the local council, and even a hospital that offered a reduced cost for pensioners in urgent need. Margaret listened, her hands trembling slightly as she held the papers. The weight of pride still lingered, but the flicker of hope grew stronger. Emily promised to help fill out the forms and submit them, offering to speak directly to the hospital if needed. Meanwhile, Mr. Chun had already started gathering support in the neighborhood. He spoke to shopkeepers, families, and even the community center. Soon, small donations began to trickle in, a few dollars here, a gift card there, even an offer from a retired carpenter to fix the loose step on Margaret's porch. One evening, as Margaret stood by the window watching the last of the light fade over Sydney's rooftops, she felt something shift inside her. For so long, she had carried everything on her own shoulders. Now, the kindness of neighbors reminded her that asking for help did not make her weak. It made her human. But even as the community's efforts grew, Margaret noticed that Daniel had become more distant. His messages were shorter, his calls less frequent. It seemed as if, in his mind, he had done what was expected during his brief visit and moved on. Margaret tried not to let the sadness consume her. Instead, she focused on each small victory: a completed form, a visit from a kind neighbor, the promise of a meeting at the hospital. The spark of change had been lit, and she was determined to see it through, no matter how long the road ahead. As she prepared for bed that night, Margaret whispered a quiet thank you to the world beyond her window, grateful for the strangers who had become her lifeline. The morning of her hospital appointment arrived with a chill in the air, the sky over Sydney heavy with gray clouds. Margaret dressed carefully, choosing her best coat, though the buttons were a little loose and the hem frayed. Emily had arranged for a community volunteer to drive her, and as the car pulled up, Margaret felt a strange mix of nervousness and relief. The hospital was large and unfamiliar, its corridors filled with the low hum of voices and the echo of footsteps. Margaret clutched her handbag tightly as Emily guided her through the maze of signs and waiting areas. They met with a kind doctor who reviewed her case, examined her leg, and spoke gently about the surgery she needed. The doctor assured her that, with the support of the schemes Emily had applied for, most of the cost would be covered. Margaret's eyes filled with tears of gratitude. But just as hope seemed to shine brightest, the cold reality struck. That evening, Daniel called. His tone was polite but distant, as if the gap between them had grown wider with every day. Margaret tried to tell him about the hospital visit, about the good news, but he barely listened. Instead, he spoke of his busy schedule, of how hard it had been to juggle work and caring for Barbara. Then came the words that chilled her to the bone. Daniel gently suggested that perhaps it would be better if Margaret considered moving into a care facility. He spoke of how it would ease her struggles, how it would be safer for her. But to Margaret, it felt like a dismissal, as if he wanted to wash his hands of the responsibility. After the call ended, Margaret sat in silence, staring at the phone in her hand. The warmth of the day's small triumphs faded, leaving only a bitter emptiness. The son she had loved so fiercely now spoke of her as a problem to be solved, not as a mother to be cherished. Outside, the rain began to fall, tapping softly against the window, as Margaret's heart ached with the weight of disappointment. The rain continued through the night and into the morning, washing the streets clean but leaving the world outside Margaret's window cold and gray. She moved slowly through the house, each step a reminder of her weakness, each silence a reminder of the words Daniel had spoken. The idea of a care facility haunted her, not because of the place itself, but because it felt like being cast aside. Later that day, Mrs. Patel visited with warm soup and a listening ear. Margaret hesitated at first, unsure whether she should share what was heavy on her heart. But as the kindness in Mrs. Patel's eyes encouraged her, the words began to spill out. The conversation with Daniel, the sense of rejection, the fear of losing the home where every corner held a memory of her late husband and of Daniel as a child. Mrs. Patel took Margaret's hand and squeezed it gently. She spoke firmly, her voice full of the strength Margaret felt she had lost. She promised that no matter what, the community would stand by her. There was no need for Margaret to leave her home. Together, they would find a way. True to her word, Mrs. Patel rallied others. That week, neighbors dropped by with meals, offers to clean the house, and even envelopes with small donations tucked inside. Emily returned with news that the hospital had approved the surgery date and that further assistance was being arranged to help with recovery at home. Margaret felt tears come easily these days, but now they were tears of gratitude. The love that Daniel seemed to have withdrawn was being replaced, piece by piece, by the compassion of those around her. As night fell, Margaret sat by the window once again, but this time, the rain felt softer, gentler, as if the world outside was finally offering comfort. The morning of the surgery dawned clear and bright, the first sunny day in weeks. Margaret awoke early, her heart beating fast with a mix of fear and hope. She dressed slowly, her fingers trembling as she buttoned her blouse. Emily and the volunteer driver arrived right on time, their warm smiles helping to steady her nerves. At the hospital, the staff treated Margaret with kindness and respect, guiding her through the final preparations. As she lay on the bed waiting to be taken to the operating room, she closed her eyes and whispered a silent prayer for strength, for healing, and for the courage to face whatever came next. The hours that followed felt like a lifetime to Margaret's neighbors, who waited anxiously for news. Mrs. Patel, Mr. Chun, and Emily gathered at Margaret's house, sharing tea and quiet conversation, their thoughts never far from their friend. At last, word came. The surgery had gone well. The doctor reported that Margaret would need time and care to heal, but she would walk again. The relief that washed over her friends was deep and genuine. Margaret awoke in the recovery room, groggy but alive with the knowledge that she had taken the first step towards reclaiming her life. When Emily visited her later that evening, bringing a small bunch of fresh flowers, Margaret's eyes filled with tears once more. This time, they were tears of victory. Outside the hospital window, the setting sun bathed the world in gold, and Margaret allowed herself a rare, true smile. The road ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in a long while, she knew she would not walk it alone. The morning of the surgery dawned clear and bright, the first sunny day in weeks. Margaret awoke early, her heart beating fast with a mix of fear and hope. She dressed slowly, her fingers trembling as she buttoned her blouse. Emily and the volunteer driver arrived right on time, their warm smiles helping to steady her nerves. At the hospital, the staff treated Margaret with kindness and respect, guiding her through the final preparations. As she lay on the bed waiting to be taken to the operating room, she closed her eyes and whispered a silent prayer for strength, for healing, and for the courage to face whatever came next. The hours that followed felt like a lifetime to Margaret's neighbors, who waited anxiously for news. Mrs. Patel, Mr. Chun, and Emily gathered at Margaret's house, sharing tea and quiet conversation, their thoughts never far from their friend. At last, word came. The surgery had gone well. The doctor reported that Margaret would need time and care to heal, but she would walk again. The relief that washed over her friends was deep and genuine. Margaret awoke in the recovery room, groggy but alive with the knowledge that she had taken the first step towards reclaiming her life. When Emily visited her later that evening, bringing a small bunch of fresh flowers, Margaret's eyes filled with tears once more. This time, they were tears of victory. Outside the hospital window, the setting sun bathed the world in gold, and Margaret allowed herself a rare, true smile. The road ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in a long while, she knew she would not walk it alone. Margaret's recovery began slowly. Days turned into weeks as she regained her strength, first learning to sit up without pain, then to stand with support, and finally to take small, careful steps. The hospital staff praised her determination, and Emily visited often, always with flowers or a warm smile. News of Margaret's progress spread through the neighborhood, and neighbors continued to visit, bringing meals, books, and kind words. The house that had once felt so lonely was now filled with the gentle hum of friendship and care. Then, one afternoon, as Margaret rested in her chair by the window, she heard a car pull into the driveway. She looked out and froze. It was Daniel. He stepped out, looking uncertain, his eyes searching the house as if he did not quite know what to expect. Margaret's heart pounded. She had imagined this moment so many times, rehearsing what she might say, but now the words escaped her. Daniel knocked softly and let himself in when she called out. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Then Daniel spoke, his voice low and filled with regret. He admitted that he had been selfish, too caught up in his own world to see how much his mother had needed him. Barbara's surgery had consumed his thoughts, but now that things had settled, he realized how deeply he had failed her. Margaret listened, her heart aching but also softening. She saw in his face the boy she had raised, the boy who had once run to her with every scraped knee and broken toy. She forgave him, not with grand words, but with a simple nod and the offer of her hand. That evening, they sat together, sharing tea as the sun set over Sydney. It was not a perfect reunion, but it was a beginning. In the weeks that followed, Daniel visited more often. Sometimes he came with Barbara, who brought flowers and offered shy smiles. Sometimes he came alone, helping Margaret in the garden or reading to her from her favorite books. Each visit helped mend what had been broken, though Margaret knew some scars would remain. The community, too, stayed close. Mrs. Patel continued to check in every morning, bringing fresh bread or fruit. Mr. Chin mowed the lawn and repaired the garden gate. Emily remained a constant support, helping Margaret through her final physiotherapy sessions and ensuring the house was safe and comfortable. One bright afternoon, as Margaret walked unsteadily but proudly along the garden path, Daniel watched with tears in his eyes. He reached out a hand, steadying her when she wobbled, and for the first time in a long while, Margaret felt truly seen. Not as a burden, not as a task to be managed, but as his mother, the woman who had raised him, loved him, and forgiven him. That evening, Margaret sat alone on her porch, the sun warm on her face and the scent of jasmine in the air. She thought of all she had lost, but also of all she had gained. The road had been painful, filled with disappointment and sorrow, but in the end, it had led her here, to peace, to love, and to the quiet joy of knowing she was never truly alone. As the stars began to appear, Margaret whispered a thank you into the night. For the strength she had found, for the kindness of strangers who became friends, and for the sun who had finally come home.